Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, hi guys, thank you for coming. This is Bobby Dixit. He's an alumnus of the engineering department at King's. I'm not going to age you by saying when you graduated, but
Fine.
he's alumnus.
Yes,
He's had,
Alex.
yeah, I'll let you say that. He's had a great career, obviously, which he's here to talk to us about. He's a member of the KCL which is the Alumni Association, which I would recommend joining when you graduate. And he's here to give us a great talk about his work at PlayStation, Sony, and founding his own AI company. So, Bobby, if you'd like to take it away, you should be able to present.
Right. Can I do this from, hold on, just give me a second. I'm trying to, if you just give me a second, let me try and get the, ooh, great, hold on. Sorry, can you see my screen?
Yep, I can see it. I assume everyone else can as well.
Right, I'm not sure how this works because it fills up my screen when I do this, so I'm not sure. Can everyone see my video as well, or is it just the screen?
I can see your screen, and there's a little video at the bottom as well.
Okay, right, great. So let's get started. Hello, everyone. My name's Bobby Dixit. I'm the son of some Kenyan Indian immigrants. I moved to England when I was about 11, and I studied in northwest London. I joined King's in 1990, and I graduated, and there's a picture of me which I happen to find in my mum's bedroom. It's a bit embarrassing, but I thought I'd put it up there, proof that I did actually go to King's. So a little bit about me. I am by very nature a little bit indecisive, easily swayed, too naive for my own good. I'd originally intended to go to Imperial, as one does, but didn't quite make the grade at the time. And I was on my way to Portsmouth University, but as luck would have it, my childhood best friend from Kenya told me that she was going to be coming to LSE. So I literally a couple of weeks. Oops, I've got some echo. I ended up switching to King's, and despite actually being offered a place by Imperial to do civil engineering, I thought, no, I'm going to try and stay near King's, and so I joined King's. Unfortunately, I didn't actually get to see much of my friend in the end, but that was that. And then, unfortunately, I wasn't really a very conscientious student, and towards the end of my second year, I was beginning to show, and I needed to do something to rediscover my mojo. And I'd always had a bit of a fascination with Japan, and at the time, the head of engineering was a gentleman called Professor Charles Turner, and he'd actually arranged for a professor, actually a visiting professor from a university in Japan called the Chiba Institute of Technology, to come and spend a year at King's. And he'd actually been at King's researching. And unfortunately, nobody from King's had had the guts to want to go the other way. And I guess I was stupid or naive enough to volunteer that I'd probably go. So I'm not quite sure still if it was the stupidest or the bravest thing I've ever done, but I did. And in 1992, I ended up getting on a plane to Japan. I remember my parents thinking literally right till like 2 days before I was going that I was actually joking. But then when I actually came home with an airline ticket in my hand, they were a bit dumbfounded. But anyway, I arrived in Japan. And I was picked up at the airport by these guys from the university. And I walked into the university reception, and a whole bunch of people in this, sort of open plan office stood up, and they all sort of went and said something. And, to me, all I heard was sort of Gaussian noise. And I sort of thought to myself, oh my God, what's going on? And so I asked the guy who was basically my handler, the person who was supposed to be looking after me. I sort of said, privately, I was kind of whispered to him, hey, what's going on? What did they say? And he said, oh, they just introduced themselves. That's where I realized I was actually quite in deep trouble, because if I didn't know when somebody's introducing themselves to me, I probably wasn't going to get very far. And so I spent probably the next couple of weeks, months, doing one of the most difficult things I've probably done in my life. Of many, but one of the most difficult was actually teaching myself Japanese in a couple of weeks' time. And then I survived a year out there, and I came back to King's, but I was hooked on Japan. And as many people may or may not know, but at the time, Japan was actually the world's powerhouse when it came to all things electronics. Before, the Samsungs and the LGs and everything else that we know about, actually Sony and Panasonic and Toshiba, Hitachi ruled the world. And so comes to my first job, actually, was at Sony. And it actually came about during my MEng placement at King's. So I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with how the MEng works. I don't know if it still works the same way, but you have to do 2 projects, 2 theses. One of them is obviously at the university, where you could do it as a team project, and mine was actually on noise shaping, filter design. And the second project is an industrial placement, where you go out and work for a company for a couple of months. And during the year I was doing my final year MEng, Sony had called King's and said, we only want to interview the top 2 candidates of your MEng course. And that turned out to be myself and this other gentleman. And boy, he was cool. He was really, really cool. He was a couple of years older than me. He was very smart, very suave. He'd actually worked in P&G for a couple of years before coming to King's. So, he was a very smooth talker, dressed very well. And, there was me, typical, skinny, long-haired, ponytail. But I went to this interview, and against all belief, I actually ended up getting the job. So I started a couple of months stint working at Basingstoke, but what I actually call boring Stoke, and did some work on transcoding, which is basically editing and manipulating digital video in the compressed domain. And the work that I did back then actually found its way into video that you guys see today in MPEG-4. And believe it or not, I was doing that before MPEG-2 became a standard. And to put that in context, that's even before DVDs were ever a thing. And yeah, then following on from that, Sony offered me a job. They said, how can you come and work for us? And for the holy sum of £16,000. And yeah, not about you guys, but we were one of the first people ever to have student loans back then. And the reason I called it Boring Stoke was because I really, really didn't like the place. It was concrete and rather unfriendly, I found back then. I'm sure it's changed now. But yeah, so I thought if I had to commute from London, it was actually not going to work, and I was probably going to end up getting poorer and poorer. So I ended up saying no to them and thought, right, I've got to go and find a job that makes me some money. So I ended up being interviewed by Fidelity. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Fidelity. It's a financial services company, quite big. They're based down in Sevenoaks in Kent. And yeah, after a couple of interviews, I actually did get the job. And but one morning while I was there, I actually got a call out the blue from a person speaking very broken English and sort of offering me to come to Tokyo for an interview. And at the time I was doing the night shift at an Italian company called Olivetti that most of you probably never heard of. Maybe David Sheridan and I are probably the only ones who know it. but I sort of, fumbled through, and I said, listen, I can't do that because I can't afford to come to Tokyo. I haven't got the money. And this lady very kindly said, no, we're going to pay for you to come. You're going to have to come and do it. And yeah, I did. I actually got the job, and I was really privileged to have been invited by the then president of Sony Semiconductor to come and join Sony. So yeah, I thought, nah, not Sevenoaks. And I was off to Tokyo. And so I don't know if anyone on this call has been to Japan. So whether you love it or hate it, I thought I'd give you a taste of it. So here goes. All right. And my second job was actually at Sony itself, in Tokyo, working for the Sony Semiconductor division. It had some very fancy name at the time. I think it was called Network AV Division. We never could figure out why, but it's beside the point. My first role was actually designing the front-end chip for satellite set-top boxes. So if any of you got Sky at home, you probably know it works on a satellite signal being received and that being converted into digital. And it's a very, very low power signal. And to recover the digital signal from it requires a bit of tricks. And that was my first job. And after that, I actually moved to designing the baseband chip for mobile phones, and something that, well, I think most of you probably have never heard of, was actually what today is 4G and 5G. Before that, it was called WCDMA, which stands for wideband CDMA. And the American standard for that, which had been adopted by Japan, was the Qualcomm standard. And I ended up at the ripe old age of, I think I was 25 or 26, being put in charge of the software simulation team. So it was about 8 of us. And we had to basically design the baseband chip in mixed signal. So simulate everything, both the analog and the digital and the crossover, which we did using a software package from Cadence. If you don't know what it is, you could probably look it up, but it's a Silicon Valley based design company. They do a lot of stuff still to this day. And of course, putting that together in one chip required using ARM processors and DSPs. And that was the first time I actually learned about digital signal processing properly. And with that role also came business trips, Cadence obviously to the US, and DSP Group was actually based in Israel. And I spent quite a few weeks out there. And to be honest, it was probably one of the most memorable trips of my life. Needless to say, some very good times. Unfortunately, we finished that project. It got bundled into Sony's phone at the time, and then I ended up being transferred to a TV design company within Sony, where most of the TVs back then were still standard definition, and HD, just like maybe 4K or HK or 8K, are still very rare these days. Back then, HD was very rare, and so there was this thought that they had to find a way to convert HD broadcast down into standard definition so people with SD TVs could receive them. Actually, product itself had very little prospect of ever reaching commercialization, but I ended up writing some code in C to model what would actually happen in hardware, and this was doing the conversion in the digital domain. That meant you're not converting the video down into sort of full video and then re-encoding it. It's actually doing some very clever filter design and using some very fancy filter coefficients to make it happen. And strangely enough, that also brought to me my first published patents, published in Sony's name, but with my name on them. Yeah, and then just moving on, Japan employment's slightly different from what you have in the UK or in the Western world. When you're hired as new grads, you kind of tend to come into a general pool, and you normally follow a sort of generalist career path. It's you normally have job rotation every couple of years, and probably for about 20-25 years of your career, every couple of years you'll move to a new place. That wasn't the case for people like myself who were hired obviously from outside of Japan. We were brought on as experts, as knowledge-based knowledge expertise. And there was an internal rule at Sony at the time that you could only stay for 5 years as a specialist. And if you at 5 years, you had a choice. You could either convert to a local employee, which meant taking like a 30% pay cut, or you could find a job at another Sony division. And Sony back then was very great because they would help you. They would actually, HR would go and talk to all the Sony group companies and say, hey, can you place this person? And I'd really wanted to go to the US. And so, I found myself, pitching for a job in San Diego. And actually, while I was there interviewing, I was staying at a hotel in La Jolla, just a place near San Diego. And I actually got a fax under my door saying that the then CTO and one of the founders of PlayStation wanted to talk to me. I'd already spoken to him a couple of times before, and he'd asked me if I wanted to work on developing wireless controllers. And I didn't really want to because I was kind of obsessed. I'd become obsessed with the internet, and this was right around the time of the first .com bubble. If you don't know what that is, please do look it up on the internet. I'm sure most of you already know what it is. But yeah, that's the one thing I wanted to do. And I said to him, look, as much as I hear you, I really want to go into all things network related. And he actually agreed. And so he gave me the opportunity. And so my single biggest claim to fame in the world, I suppose, is that I joined PlayStation and would become employee number one for what would ultimately become PlayStation Online today, or PSN. So yeah, that's that. And unfortunately, when I joined, he still made me do the project on the wireless controllers for PlayStation 2. And there's some pictures of them. And I actually worked, myself and a few other people, we actually designed the wireless protocol to allow 8 players to play together on one game, on one screen. And this is going back to a day when when Bluetooth was still in its very early days. It barely sort of did 1 megabit per second. And, we needed something that could transmit and receive it over 10 megabits per second, with a latency of around 50 or 60 milliseconds. If you imagine that's the frame rate, that's the rate at which your TV screen changes the picture. So you needed it to react in that time frame. So we've built a proprietary wireless protocol to do that. And believe it or not, I got another patent, or I think it was a couple of patents for that one. And it was the only patents that so far or to date have ever made me any money. I did actually get some money for making those. And then, yeah, after a couple of slow starts, but we did eventually get there, we built some hardware with the network adapter for PlayStation 2. And that's what it looked like. It had a line and a network. I'm not sure how many people are familiar, but you could connect just not an Ethernet cable to it, but also a phone line, because back then, most internet connections were actually not even DSL, they were dial-up. They used a modem where you would dial up and it would convert audio signals into digital. And this kind of plugged into the back of a PS2, which is there. If you look at the back, there's a little box which a hard disk was supposed to slot into. And there was a little proprietary interface there where the network adapter plugged into. And when you connected it, it looked a little bit like that, which was a bit clunky and not very nice, but there you have it. So this is where things got a bit interesting, because the world was, you know, kind of regionally very different. Japan was far ahead of the Western world. DSL was taking off, and albeit it was still sort of in single digit megabit per second, but you know, it was completely different from the US and most of Europe, which was still running on dial-up modems. But surprisingly, Japan's first rollout connectivity with PlayStation was actually on mobile. It was a game that connected to Docomo's mobile phones, where it was a little bit like sort of, you know, looking after your pet type game, of which, you know, I'm sure there's many of them. And so the network adapter in Japan only had an Ethernet port, whereas the ones for the rest of the world had both connectivity. Now, unfortunately, there was a bit of a problem, and in that was that both PlayStation, and I include myself in that, didn't have any experience in online development. You know, we were still very much a hardware company. And in fact, not sure how many people know, but PlayStation was actually initially a joint venture between Sony, the hardware company, and Sony Music. And of course, at the time, the key market was the US, of course, Europe, and we weren't going to go out and become an internet company ourselves. So we had to do it by developing partnerships and alliances with others. And of course, even back then, as you can imagine, you know, one of the key markets was the US. And the largest ISP in the US at the time was a company called AOL. And at its peak, AOL probably had more than 30 million, I think it was somewhere between 30 and 35 million members. And it was also one of the first ISPs to actually embrace the web. And, you know, you literally are talking around 1999, 2000. It was also the company that popularized or made instant messenger famous. So AIM, as AOL Instant Messenger, was probably the world's first true instant messenger that millions of people used. And they'd also just acquired Time Warner, company that's behind Matrix and Lord of the Rings. And at the time, their merger was about 350 billion, and still remains probably one of the largest mergers of all time. And unfortunately, my boss, who'd been trying to negotiate with them, had hit a bit of a brick wall. And he was actually trying to talk to a gentleman called Michael Linton, who at the time was the CEO of AOL International, and incidentally, somebody I know because he went on to become the president of Sony Pictures. And he basically lost his cool with my boss and said, next time you bring somebody here, I want them to be able to speak English. And so one thing led to another. I spent time after coming back from the UK. 3 days later, I was on a plane to New York. And about 2 months later, I was moved off and moved to live in San Francisco. And for the next 18 months, I traveled between San Francisco and New York probably about every 3 weeks. And incidentally, yes, I was in the US during 9/11. And in fact, I was due to fly to New York from San Francisco that very morning. So yeah, one cat life down on that one. Luckily, didn't get on the plane. But yeah, I spent 2 years negotiating honing my negotiation skills and negotiating with AOL Time Warner. Now, the problem with AOL Time Warner was that they were not just a dumb pipe ISP. They had their own closed ecosystem. Their content, just like you can imagine, a lot of the content was within the AOL ecosystem. You had to kind of get to them, and they'd only allow open access via web browser in very restricted cases. Normally, all the content was aggregated and displayed within the AOL world. And they did this by just having literally a few lines of code. I think it was literally 5 or 6 lines of code, which meant that their connection to the outside world or to the internet was non-standard compared to other ISPs who were using the 56 or 34 kilobit per second dial-up modems. And at the time we were using it's a standard V90, V92 protocol. And one of the key things was that it allowed them to put their logo, that AOL online logo, on the screen would pop up before the user got connected to the rest, to their content. And of course, one of the key things for PlayStation was, my boss and the founder of PlayStation, Ken Kutaragi, was hell-bent that he didn't ever want to see AOL Time Warner pop up on every single online PlayStation game. And our negotiating position was, never in hell are you going to get your logo on our games. And of course, to them, it was their religion. They needed that because they owned the user. And so over the course of about 18 months, we literally wore them down. And, we were and I'm not going to draw any parallels to what's happening in the world today, but it was this fundamental difference about, opened or closed access. And, AOL, to them, the branding was about losing their religion. And they had 8 lawyers on their end. And there was just 3 of us, myself, and 2 other people I worked very closely with, 2 lawyers from PlayStation. And after about 18 months, we literally wore them down. And of course, it was kind of helped by the fact that the AOL Time Warner merger was failing spectacularly, and their share price, from a company that was worth hundreds of billions, had probably ended up being somewhere about a 10th or 1/15th or what it was. And the day we signed the deal, and that's us. And just to rub it in, my boss, who's this gentleman in the back there, and he was the general counsel of PlayStation, Dan and myself, we took the AOL team out and we bought them this T-shirt in recognition of their work, because we knew, unfortunately, that once they'd signed the deal that they were about to get fired. So it was a bit unfortunate, but it was kind of our way of also showing our appreciation. But there was also some successes with AOL. We did, and I worked pretty damn hard to put Linux to run on PlayStation 2 and to demonstrate it at E3 in LA 2001, 2002. Here's some folks from the AOL team, myself. Oh boy, I look young. And this guy over here is Ken Kutaragi, who's the founder, the guy who founded PlayStation. Right, moving on. So I returned to Japan, and I'm not quite sure if it was the best thing I ever did, but I can reflect on it. And I ended up working on some of the key projects for PlayStation at the time. One of probably the biggest ones was PSX. PSX was actually a Sony branded product, not a PlayStation branded product. And it was actually a DVR, so it was a digital video recorder, but one that could play PlayStation games as well. And this was something that Ken dreamt up one day in January of that year. In February, he announced that we were going to build it. Literally, I think it was the first week of February. And he told us he wanted to launch it on the 4th of December. And it was just that year, the way the Japanese calendar worked, the date would be 1, 2, 3, 4. So he'd set the date in mind, and he was adamant we were going to go from concept to mass production in a grand total of less than 11 months. It's probably the craziest project I've ever worked on. I think the team, we were clocking between 260 and 300 hours a month. And I think one morning at 3 a.m. in the morning, we kind of worked out that the project managers, we were earning less than the people at McDonald's at the time. So just to put it in context. But one of the big things that did come out of PSX was Cross Media Bar. And this was a project that I project managed, and it was the GUI that was designed and developed for PSX. And it was a very unique way of arranging content vertically across different content streams across the horizontal. And it would allow a user to navigate content on their device, both by using either a controller or a remote control, a normal remote control. And actually, Cross Media Bar was probably was one of the most unique successes of PlayStation, because it found itself onto not just PS3, but PSP, and a lot of Sony DVD players, Blu-ray players, TVs, even mobile phones, and ultimately, probably if not tens, but probably hundreds of millions of devices ultimately had Cross Media Bar as their GUI. I put a picture up of PSP. I did quite various different projects on PSP, including some on standardization. We looked at putting things like Skype on PSP. That was, before we had FaceTime and all the rest of it. But anyway, some interesting things. I also was one of the managers as part of the team that developed the tool and middleware program, and that was allowing different third-party technologies, particularly like physics engines and audio video libraries of other companies who wanted to sell their ware to game developers and publishers. And I also made a name for myself at the time for basically being a bit of a troubleshooter and honing my negotiating skills further. And I took on the role of also being Sony's lead negotiator for several licensing deals. One of them was a unique one for G-Guide. I'm happy to talk about later if anyone's interested, but yeah, we ended up saving Sony so $10 million in licensing fees on that particular deal. And then a year or two later, in 2004, the end of 2004 and 2005, there was PlayStation 3 and Cell. And for those of you who are not familiar with Cell was the CPU, was the core that was going to be used for PlayStation 3. And it was a joint development between Sony, IBM, and Toshiba. and it was based on IBM's PowerPC architecture with some very, very fancy changes. And there's an article which actually, if any of you are interested, you can read that. I don't know how recent it is, but there is a claim that Cell probably remains one of the most powerful chips, and certainly comparable to most desktop CPUs that exist, even to this day. But there was a huge problem with it, and that was programming it. It was an absolute bitch to program. Very few people could actually write code and optimize their code to run on it to get the power benefit that Cell could provide. And PlayStation 3 was in danger of launching without any games at launch. And clearly that was going to be a huge problem for the platform. And so it became a classic business strategy problem. So we had a couple of options. We could develop the sort of debugger and compiler tools for it ourselves, which meant hiring a new team, completely building up a team from scratch, because we ourselves, PlayStation, didn't have that know-how. We could outsource that development to some specialist companies, and then we went through a program figuring out how many of those companies actually existed out there in the world, apart from IBM itself. IBM obviously had developed the PowerPC, and we came up and identified two companies that were up to the task. One was Metroworks, which at the time was owned by Motorola, and SN Systems, which was at the time predominantly developing debuggers and compilers for Nintendo. They happened to be based in Bristol. But there was a fundamental problem in that if you outsource the development of this kind of work, you end up never truly owning the IP and the know-how. And if you're a platform business like PlayStation, that's akin to suicide. You're literally letting the power of development rest in somebody else's hand. And then brings you to the third option is, do you buy that know-how and you own it? And since we bloody well couldn't afford to buy IBM, it had to be one of the other two. For various reasons, Metroworks was too large, too diversified, they were too expensive. So we ended up focusing on choosing to buy SN Systems, and it was a company that had been founded and was owned by two chaps. As I said, one was a farmer, the other one was a car geek, and not too dissimilar from what had happened with AOL. I found myself on a plane once again, this time back to the UK with one colleague, and we started the negotiations to buy the company. And not for the first time in my life, I found myself completely out of depth again, and I needed to gain a completely new set of skills, which was how to buy a company. And so I hired various financial advisors, a legal team. Well, FAs were E&Y, legal team was Baker McKenzie, and I ran the project to acquire SN for PlayStation. And SN, on the other hand, had a Kiwi guy as their, he was a New Zealander, who was their financial advisor. And his unique skill was he just couldn't tell the truth, even if his mother's life depended on it. And so it was just the most excruciating, painful negotiation I've probably had the privilege of leading. Challenges around sort of doing the due diligence. One of them, for example, was that because it had been owned by Matthew and Andy, these two guys, they'd never filed a patent for all their work. So all their know-how was in the heads of these people, and their team. And so we literally had to rely on the fact that, we needed the team, and we couldn't afford anyone to leave, because there was no patents protecting their know-how. Anyway, we ended up buying the company successfully, and just sort of, you know, as I said, I ran the project from start to end, including merging the company with PlayStation, and that's sort of what it looks like today if you go to SN's office in Bristol. However, there was a sort of sting to the tail, and you know, we were on our course to win sort of the MVP award for PlayStation that year, except we ended up discovering some fraud at SN's Japan office. It turned out their Japan staff, the head of Japan office, had been skimming some money off the company, and actually we'd kind of sensed something was wrong, and my team and I had flagged this to the senior management at PlayStation. However, the executives in charge had shot us down and overridden it and told us to get on with it. They felt that we were wasting time, and of course what ended up happening is said executive got away for not listening to us, and we took the fall for it. So just switching gears, just wonder how many of you are aware of or know what a walled garden is. And I know we're going to get in some questions later, but I happen to love walled gardens. And in this instance, the walled garden I'm talking about is a closed ecosystem. I already alluded to one, which was the AOL, but it's one where the software or the service provider controls your access to applications and content and or media, and may and almost certainly restricts access to other non-approved content or applications. And that's very much in contrast to, you know, an open platform where you have access to everything. I'm sorry, I took that out of Wikipedia because it was just it was a nice, easy definition to put up there. And as you probably already guessed, probably the most famous walled garden today that exists is obviously things like Apple. But as I've already mentioned, the business model itself didn't start with Apple. In fact, AOL were one of the first companies ever to successfully build a business model and monetize creating walled garden content behind a walled garden. The first, probably most successful mobile walled garden, even before anything that we see on Apple or Google Play, was Japan's iMode. iMode existed on Docomo's phones. It was launched in 1999, again by a couple of people who I happened to meet during my time at PlayStation. But it was the most successful mobile walled garden in Japan, and probably still remains one of the most famous. More famous ones more recently are obviously our Kindle, and then there's of course PlayStation. And one of the key differences that PlayStation has between, say, Nintendo and, you know, Xbox is very much closer to PlayStation than Nintendo, is that we, as a platform, PlayStation allows third parties, it allows other companies to develop games for its platform. So the business of PlayStation, SIE as it's known today, and SCE as it was known when I was there, is to provide the hardware and software that allows others to develop content on it. And we then control who comes onto that platform, what they build, what they put on it. And so there is an approvals process. So certain things, you know, obviously you can imagine, you know, whether it's certain types of unsavory content or age restricted, or for what other reasons that we might not want on the platform, are rejected. And that's a model that actually has been applied very successfully by Apple. So Apple and Steve Jobs literally tore a page out of PlayStation's book when they created iTunes initially for iPod, and then following on the iPhone and App Store models. And so just like Apple and maybe not so Kindle or others, but there is this concept of first and third party software. So although a lot of the software for PlayStation is developed by third parties, some of it is actually developed by PlayStation 2. And it's a long conversation, which I don't want to get drawn into, but happy to talk about it if anyone's interested. But I just want you to contrast that between the commoditization of hardware that generally has happened. Part of the reasons why previously mobile phones, especially, it was a race to the bottom of the cheapest price. This happened with DVD players. It happened with a lot of hardware and particularly with ISPs of the past, was that they basically provided access, and they could provide a flat fee for that access, but it was actually the content. It was people. We used to call it in PlayStation parlance or in media parlance. It's the competition for eyeballs. It's how much can you keep people's eyes focused on your particular content. So in the world of PlayStation and online entertainment, content is king. And the PlayStation platform consists of sort of four primary streams. There's obviously PlayStation Plus, which is on-demand games. There's PlayStation Now, which allows you to sort of play multiplayer gaming. There's obviously video and music. Rather than spend too much time on it, it goes into it. And of course, one thing I don't want to forget here is that this doesn't include all the games that are actually still, a huge majority of them, still shipped and sold through retail on Blu-ray discs. And both first-party and third-party games are still sold for the 40, 50, whatever pounds per pop, whether you buy them at Argos or wherever. So that's the kind of business model. Now, I think we all know some very big third-party studios, EA, Konami, Square Enix, just to name a few. This UK's most famous one is Codemasters, and if any of you have seen the news today on BBC, EA, Electronic Arts, has just put in a bid to acquire Codemasters for a deal worth just over £1 billion. It'd be interesting to see how that plays out for both Codemasters and whether somebody's going to up the bid for them. But within PlayStation itself, within SIE, there are 12 first-party studios that make actual games. And there is also a unit called XDev, and this is now run by a gentleman called Shuhei Yoshida, who was the ex-head of Worldwide Studios, but he's now taken over this unit, which really works with developing indie games on PlayStation. So if any of you are really interested in developing your own indie game, a good port of call would be XDev. But I've put on some information in the time I've been speaking. Hopefully you've managed to read what's on there, but just gives you a clue of some of the top titles that are there. I didn't actually put it up here because I didn't have space, but I worked quite closely with Polyphony Digital, and Polyphony is famous for Gran Turismo, which I'll touch upon right here, in fact. So just to give everyone a sense of just how big PlayStation as a platform is, last year in November, The Guinness Book of Records recognized and awarded PlayStation the award for having sold the most number of video game consoles in the world. The figure there is for November last year, so 450 million across the 4 platforms. And PlayStation 4 alone, hardware at the time was 106 million consoles and about 1.15 billion copies of games and about 5 million VR headsets. Gran Turismo, which I mentioned earlier on, is the longest running franchise on the PlayStation platform. It's been going for 21 years. And I know that they're working on a version for PlayStation 5, which who knows when it's going to come out. For those of you, I'm sure as many of you probably know more about it than I do, but PlayStation 5 is considered the largest console launch in history. It launched with around 2.5, somewhere between 2.1 and 2.5 million units in the first 2 weeks. It's certainly the largest launch the UK has ever seen. So PS4 sold, I think, about 250,000 in the first couple of days. And I don't remember if it was 2 days or 4 days, but the word out of Sony is that PS5 beat that. So, and it's on target to sell 7.5 million units by March next year. And getting to the end, I was lucky enough to visit Japan last December. It was quite literally just before the whole COVID and the Diamond Princess fiasco, sort of took off. And I was there, and I was lucky enough to have been invited to the 25th anniversary party at PlayStation. And so, yeah, just a couple of pictures. There's myself. This is the guy who I mentioned at the very beginning in 1999. He's one of the founders of PlayStation. His name is Shinichi Okamoto. He was the CTO of PlayStation for a very long time. And this is part of our core team. And this is the guy who ran the software development team for pretty much everything up to PS5. She back then was his PA and is now a very famous author in her own right. Somebody holding up her book in the background. Oops. And yeah, there's the three of us in front of Sony's SIE's headquarters in Tokyo in December last year. And I'm just going to skip through this because I'm sure most of you don't really want to know, but my fourth job was not at Sony. I had worked for probably 6 or 7 different divisions of Sony by the time I finished. I did move on after that. I became an investment banker. I worked for Mizuho, which is one of the $3 trillion mega banks of Japan. The others being Mitsubishi and SMBC. And I helped establish Mizuho's cross-border international M&A advisory. And here's just some of the names of the companies I did deals with. And 2 of them, for example, I worked on the deal where Canon bought the last remaining digital printer business in Europe, which was OSE of the Netherlands. And that was I think 1.4 or 1.5 billion euro acquisition at the time. After that, I stayed with Mizuho. I moved to Singapore. I worked in Singapore for a couple of years, working for a team called the Asia Financial Solutions Division. As the name suggests, we were there to look for innovative solutions to Mizuho's clients, who were all blue chip companies. And it was a bit like basically selling, sand to the beach, selling money to people who didn't really need it. But anyway, did that for a couple of years. Came back home after a very long time away, and found myself working for HMG, Her Majesty's government. I worked for Department of International Trade, and it was better known as UKTI back then. I was stationed half in the UK and half at the British Embassy in Tokyo. Spent basically 3 weeks here back home and 3 or 4 weeks in Japan. And I was tempted to put up a picture of it, which I don't have, which is somewhere, if I can look for it, is a million miler badge. So I think in the space of about 10 months, I clocked up about 85, maybe 90,000 miles. Incidentally, during my time at Sony, I probably did around 650,000 miles in business trips across the globe. 1 year, I did 4 distinct trips that were round the world trips, one of them being going the opposite way, so against the clock, as it were. Yeah, I did work for the government for a year and a half, did some very interesting things. And I actually left 2 weeks before the original Brexit vote in 2016. So whether you want to call that serendipity or something else, I leave it for you to decide. My most recent job, as Tiana mentioned, I then, had always had the urge to try something myself. I'd always wanted to build something. I had an idea, come up about driverless cars and how, the biggest hurdle to driverless car adoption is not going to be the robotics or the AI itself, but it's actually security. It's the hackability and how, the risk of them being turned into weapons of mass destruction. I'd learned a little bit about blockchain, obviously being in finance, and I thought applying that to IoT came up with a very unique way of doing LBA, which is location-based authentication. I was actually working with Dr. Simon Miles, who some of you might recognize his name. He's obviously at King's. He's a reader at computer science, and he and I had a meeting of minds, should we say, about what he was doing and what I was doing. Yeah, unfortunately, things are a little bit on pause on AIMS. As you can imagine, COVID has taken its toll on not just the big companies, but the smaller companies like us as well. And right now I'm sort of searching for new inspiration. And that's it. I'm going to close, if you want, with another short video on Japan, just to leave you with some thoughts, certainly a message of hope.
Wow, thank you, Bobby. Oh, I'll let you stop sharing your screen. That was, yeah. If we were in person, we'd all give you a round of applause. I think most people would agree. I think, at least for me, you've had one of the most interesting careers and lives of anyone I've ever met. Just from the fact that you met the founder of PlayStation, your investment banker. I mean, what else is left for you to do?
Lots, I'd like to think.
Well, I mean, if I'd done that, I'd already be satisfied. I think there are questions. I'll start with the early ones. I know people want to ask themselves, ask the questions themselves. I'll start with one that was very early on. How far ahead does Sony plan PlayStation out? I assume they mean the games and the development. Apple has a 5-year plan, but does Sony have something like that, or is it a 2-year rolling plan?
No. Normal a PlayStation cycle, if you imagine PS1, PS2, even from PS4 to PS5, 7 years. And it normally takes PlayStation anywhere between 3 and 5 years to start developing the next platform. So if you imagine PS5 was launched just a couple of weeks ago, the development for that would probably have started, the planning for it would probably have started somewhere in 2015, around 2015, if not earlier, but certainly the software for that. Games, it really depends. The software is, making PlayStation games today is akin to making movies. A game can be millions and millions of pounds in the making. So an example, Gran Turismo, the guy who makes it, he's an absolute maniac. I mean, each car is, he goes on each track, each race course, the physics of each race course are modeled. The physics of each car, each component is modeled. And that process, I think a GT game is £25 million to make, 5 years. But I mean, even a normal game that you could pick up for PS4 is, it's probably millions of pounds to actually make. And I've never known a decent game to be made in under 24 months.
Sounds about right. Sorry, can I just ask you to stop sharing your screen so your face?
Oh yes, sure. How do I?
Just click. No, right. The X at the top.
Sorry.
Right. That
there.
One.
Yeah. Okay.
That's the one.
Sorry.
It's all right. I'll ask one more question from the chat, and then the two people with their hands raised can ask theirs. Can you rate how university has prepared you for each stage of your career, whether it was at the start of Sony or when you launched your AI company?
Wow.
And be nice, because you're talking to a King's audience.
I think it's really hard to compare, and I mean, I said it very early on. I think if you look at my first or second slide, I decided, I was going to take a year out in my third year, for better or worse. And so I used that, again, for better or worse, to go to the other side of the world where, I was far away from home. Nobody spoke English. And, you're talking about the days where, you couldn't pick up the phone so easily and call somebody. There was no such thing as FaceTime, whatever. It was, still the days of writing airmail letters. And I remember getting a lot of airmail letters from my parents, and writing back to them. And I think, hadn't I done that, would I have had the career that I did? Probably not. So in my case, yeah, absolutely. University and the year out that I took, and the fact that I chose to go and visit another university and study there, whether it was the language skill, whether it was just, the willingness to just pick up my bags and just go. You know, there's just that ability to look at something that others might think of, you know, a risk too far, or, you know, a foolhardy endeavor. So I definitely think, you know, university was absolutely core in carving me and what I've become.
It's good to hear. Okay, so we'll go to the raised hands. Sorry if I pronounce your name wrong. Oshin?
Yeah, that's me. First off, Bobby, it's
Hi.
an absolute honor to meet you virtually, as the PlayStation 2, PlayStation 3, and PSP were my childhood in a nutshell. I would like take my PSP with me everywhere, and like I had the original Battlefront 2 cartridge in it, and so I would like play that all the time. Now my question is on Xbox's strategy. Right now they're going after cloud gaming with a vengeance. Do you think Sony should emulate them? They should start going more into allowing the power of Sony really to be on more mobile devices?
I'm not a PlayStation anymore, so I can only offer conjecture. I'm not sure if you know, but Google Games is currently headed by a guy called Phil Harrison, and I know Phil from a long time ago. Phil was the head of worldwide studios at PlayStation, and he obviously sees you know, a future in cloud gaming. Otherwise, I'm sure he probably wouldn't have gone and taken up that role at Google that he has. Aside from obviously, you know, very large number of zeros after a figure, but of salary. But do I think Xbox? The short answer to your question is it's inevitable. I think whether it's PlayStation, whether it's others, there is this element of, you know, that it will become virtual, it will become cloud-based. There will be different aspects, though, you know. One thing I mentioned, which we didn't really talk about, for example, is VR. And, you know, the game industry as a whole, you know, is an early adopter. It has led a lot of technologies. Now, I don't know how many of you actually know, but, you know, DVD, for example, DVD would never ever have taken off in the world if it wasn't for PlayStation, because PlayStation is the device that suddenly let people have a DVD player in their home, like millions of them. Up until then, up until PlayStation 2 was sold, total sales of DVD players have probably been like 75, 100,000. And like within the space of a few months, you know, you had millions of them. So the same kind of applies to technologies like VR, and cloud gaming will no doubt, you will see, you know, particularly with PS5 and with its architecture and the way it's been built. I wouldn't be surprised if you see a huge shift to that. And I'm sure they have quite some interesting things in store for that space. I hope I've answered your question, but yeah, you know, you will see that shift. You know, the gaming industry, like certain that probably I'm not allowed to mention, are you know, are where the early adopters are. It's where the tech people reside, and yeah, it's something that will happen.
Yeah, just have one more question.
Sorry to interrupt. Can we go to the other people who have their hands up? Don't worry, we'll get to you. Just to make it fair. David Stoyanovsky, do you still have a question or no?
Yeah, so it's kind of a semi-dual part question, but I've kind of heard this referred to in the media as like a Sonyism, and I wanted to ask like how does ideas in such a big company get into the final product? So I know of like a few examples of very small things, like for example in the PS2 I think it was, but the PlayStation 3 for sure, like where you could rotate the logo depending on the orientation, and it seems like I wouldn't really expect an idea like this to come from high up. Like, is this coming from lower down from engineers, or how do these kinds of things work?
So one of the key things I think which was very unique about Sony, and it shows in its, particularly in PlayStation, but Sony was very, very unique as a Japanese company in that its product design was it kind of like the Italians, right? The French do something unique, the Germans have engineering, but the one thing that the Italians do is industrial design. Only the Italians can make something like a Lamborghini or a Ferrari, and very few other people can emulate that. And so I was privileged enough, to work at Sony, where Sony was renowned for its product design, and so the people who did the industrial design, and you can see that in something like Cross Media Bar, so that's not top down. That's engineers, and it's the people who design and develop it are people. I don't want to say like myself, because I'm not intending to make it sound like a brag, but there's no, it's very much a collaborative process, but a lot of that gets picked up in sort of design committees. It gets picked up through, field trials, whether you're running it with, end user, focus groups. In gaming, for example, that's a big way how things get picked up is through focus groups, and obviously through testing. But I wouldn't want to extend to how Samsung or LG do it, but in Sony it's very much bottom up.
Okay, if I'm allowed a second part of this question, but do you feel that these kind of aspects are underappreciated? Because Sony used to be very large back in the 90s, and previously with the Walkman and so on, but they seem to have dropped off over time, and then companies like Apple have come through. But in actual fact, if you look at technical specifications and things like this, they still seem to produce the best, but they're not necessarily the most popular in the market.
I think Sony's decline probably didn't really have much to do with that. It was actually really fundamental in sort of some of the business decisions it made. If anything, it didn't have anything to do with the products themselves. It was just the course that certain companies chose, and as an industry, whether it was Apple, but Samsung and LG overtook the Japanese companies, and it wasn't because they necessarily had better design. They just had better processes. They had a better view of what end users wanted, and they could develop and they could react faster.
Okay, thank you very much.
David Sheridan, I hope you don't mind, and Yuli, we have the questions in the chat are piling up. I think the next one's actually from Yuli anyway. How do you happen to have any information about why PlayStation has changed online play from a free service on PS3 to a paid service on PS4 and following? Do you have any information you can share?
I think it will be a mix. You know, PS3 was very much about, you know, and even PS4, if you recall, was still very much about the media. The media I'm talking about is the disc, right? It's the Blu-ray disc or the DVD disc. PS3, PS4, you know, was still very much, you know, going out and buying the retail, and you could recoup your sales on that. PS5, as you know, comes out in two different flavors. One that has a disc, has a UHD player, and one that's a digital only version. And for that, the only way of monetizing the development cost is through charging for content, and that's a natural progression. You know, that's no different from what any other, you know, ecosystem, any other walled garden, how any other walled garden works. You know, whether that's Apple, Google, it's the fundamental way the business is intended to function, how the ecosystem pays for itself.
I think this is a good question from Pablo that follows on from this. What do you think PlayStation has that makes people buy that instead of a gaming PC?
It's the experience. There's, you know, PC gaming, you know, and I you know, I build my own PCs. I'm not, strangely enough, a lot of people find this surprising, but once you start working for PlayStation, you know, 11, 12 hours of your day is taken up working. So the last thing you want to do when you come home is pick up a game and play it. A lot of people do, but a lot of people at PlayStation just don't have the time, you know, because you're so busy at work. But what makes it unique is absolutely the user experience. It's you know, the fact that PlayStation is and always intended to be a living room experience. You know, it's intended to be large screen. You know, PlayStation, for example, is, I'm never saying never, but you know, it's never going to be a keyboard and mouse experience, right? So, and there's just something fundamental about how you interact with something. I don't know if, you know, I don't want to get into sort of detail, but one of the key things, for example, on PlayStation 2, that when I did that controller was the haptic feedback. So when you're actually using the controller, it, you know, if you're trying to climb a hill, you know, the controller tells you literally the strength that you try and pull on the rope and the resistance, and you get that haptic feedback. And that, for example, is never something you're going to get on a keyboard and mouse. So it's not that one is better or worse. It's just a completely different user experience. And the people who develop, you know, console games are aiming more for that than they are, you know, a different type of, you know, MLLP, massive, you know, multiplayer games have their place. It's not to say, you know, there's anything worse about them, right? They're perfectly brilliant form of gaming. It's just, you know, it's the target audience and the user experience is a different aspect to it.
Yuli, I'm going to go back to the raised hands. I don't know if you want to read out the question you just posted.
I can read it myself if you want.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, this is a link. Yeah, this is basically linked to my previous question, because the reason why I asked about the transition from free to paid online is because right now kind of the situation is with games on PC and even on mobile, so Android and iOS. If you get a game and you play it online, the online is free. Whereas now for all the three major consoles, so you know, for Xbox, PlayStation, and also for Nintendo Switch, they all have their online like membership subscription that you need to pay regularly in order to play games online. If you don't pay these, then you can only kind of play the single player part of the game, right? So I'm just like, you know, it seems interesting to me how like the console have like a different strategy to kind of the PC and mobile games. So I'm just wondering if you have any opinions on that.
I actually would, you know, I'm not necessarily disagreeing, but if you look at Apple, for example, has the Apple Arcade, which is a fixed price subscription. I don't know, is it $4.99 a month that allows you to play however many games? And part of that, in short, is actually driven not by the platform. It's actually driven by the publishers and the content developers. So, for example, on, let's say, Android, just because it's an easier thing to explain, building a freemium game is quite easy because you can find other ways to monetize or to offset your development cost. And a lot of that is for example, is ads, right? You play the game for free, but you kind of put up with a certain level of intrusion, or the game developer will put in a certain level of ads in it. The ads are what pays the developer for building, for putting the money into developing the game. You've got micropayments in games where, you can buy extra health, extra whatever. That's another way they monetize it. On PlayStation, Xbox, Nintendo, there is an upfront platform fee, just as there is with Apple. If you want to become an Apple developer, if you want to become a PlayStation developer, you actually do pay a platform fee. And for example, the development kit, if you want to develop a PS4 or PS3 or PS5 game, you can't do it on your PC. You actually need to buy a specific hardware to develop it, and that's another cost. And how do you recoup that? It's a little bit similar to like Gods of War or something like that on PC. You still have to pay for it somehow, whether it's paid by ad revenue, whether it's some other mechanism of subscription, or whether it's in-game purchasing. Ultimately, it's just a different model. But where and how the end user pays is just different. I hope I've answered your question.
Can I just add something onto that quickly? I think, yeah, so the online, I get what you're saying, but I think the online membership that the three consoles have, I think those are, when you pay those, the cost, I think they go directly to like Microsoft, Sony, and Nintendo. I don't think that trickles down to like any of the game developers. So I think the fees they are put there by the platform,
Yeah,
right? By Sony,
the
Microsoft,
way it works is that that subsidizes the publisher cost. Otherwise, PlayStation or Xbox would charge the publishers that fee, and then they would end up making it anyway. It's just it's direct revenue as opposed to indirect revenue.
Okay, so like part of the fees kind of decreases the cost on the developers. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, in essence. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we'll go to David Sheridan. I know you've been waiting a while. Thanks.
Hi, Bobby. Very fascinating talk. From your fantastic experience that you've had, what do you think the difference is between Japan in particular and the UK in fostering engineering initiatives?
Well, I think we've discussed this before, but it still remains, and this is, I think the facts speak for themselves, that Japan historically and still continues to operate, both public, in private companies and in public companies, a mechanism where the transition from learning, whether it's high school, through university into companies is rewarded, and it's something that just students are by and large not, I wouldn't say just encouraged to do, but there's a huge infrastructure in place that allows hundreds and thousands of graduates to find work at companies like Sony, Fujitsu, and others. Yes, I think there's also the fact that how many champions of engineering does the UK have left compared to Japan? Whilst there has been a decline in Japan, yes, you've seen the Samsungs and LGs come up, but still, you can't compare that. Japan still has these behemoths. It has the Hitachis, Fujitsu. I mean, most of, I don't want to say most, but a very large part of NHS actually runs on Fujitsu software. And yeah, it's intrinsic. It's part of their DNA, and part of it could be said to be post-war planning. But I just think that there's just a mindset difference. And so, yeah, for me, I think the learning I had at Sony in Japan, unfortunately, was probably far different from an equivalent person may have had at an engineering firm in the UK. And it's regrettable, but I think that's sadly a fact.
Thank you. There are quite a few questions in the chat. I'm not sure whether you have to dash off or whether you're willing to answer all of them.
I'm happy to, I'm happy to stay on for.
Lovely.
Yeah.
I don't completely understand this question, but I'll read it anyway. And perhaps Omar, you can expand on what you meant. Maybe it's just because it's late. Cloud-based gaming is heavily reliant on good internet. So what do you think about the progression and expansion of good, fast, and reliable internet in the future? I assume he's asking about internet as opposed to PlayStation.
Ooh, I'm sort of, maybe you can expand what are you talking about? Something like 5G? Are you talking about, FTTH? Are we talking, is it about how you're going to go from a sort of, best effort internet to one that has QoS? I'm just wondering, sorry, I'm not sure how best to answer that question.
Omar,
hi.
if you want to.
Yeah,
there you are.
hi, Omar.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Likewise. Yeah, please do explain what you meant. I'll try my best to answer.
I think what my question is initially, but I just wanted to say, how do you see not cheap, but good, reliable home internet being more widely established as of currently now? Because I would say, currently now, most houses normally get around maybe 100 to 200 megabits per second. What could you see, maybe even gigabit internet coming into regular households in the next 10 years or so?
Beep well hope so. To give you this, I'll give you some context. Yeah, Omar. Yeah. When I lived in Japan, and I'm talking about, let's just say 12 years ago. 12 years ago, I had a fiber line coming into my home.
Okay.
So, it was there even 12 years ago. Countries like Japan and Korea. This kind of comes back to a little bit to what Sheridan was alluding about. There's a kind of mindset difference, in how much does a government, does a country invest, not just in STEM education, but in infrastructure, in things like that. So you'd certainly expect it to be there. And I don't know if you're familiar, but so UK government has announced a couple of initiatives to get ultra fast broadband, into homes, and there is this concept of getting fiber in the home. But at the end of the day, the flip side is somebody still has to pay for it, right? You still have to, and if you say that, well, I only want to pay 20 quid a month, but actually to put a fiber into your home, let's say for not Virgin, I won't use Virgin, but let's say Vodafone or any of the other suppliers to provision that, if they have to recoup that over a 5-year period, that the cost is probably closer to 50 or 60 pounds. So it's a kind of balance who pays for it. But I'd hope that those things will also start to be addressed when 5G sort of takes off in a real way, because 5G and what's coming down the line with sort of 6G, which it's there, but you will see that sort of multi-gigabit access. How long it's going to take, I have no idea.
Because especially Microsoft, because they're so trying to push cloud internet, I mean, their progression is only going to be dependent on how well good internet will be established. I mean, in most places, isn't it then? Or
yes and no. Yes, no. For gaming, I think gaming, believe it or not, is actually not tied necessarily to the speed of internet, but it's actually tied to the frame rate on your screen, because the fastest you can play a game is the speed at which your screen refreshes. So which is where you've seen things like PS5, for example, have HFR. HFR stands for high frame rate. So instead of your 60 frames or 50 frames per second, which was PAL, game updating at 120 hertz, 120 times a second. So whatever that translates into, so I can't do the inverse of that in my head, but so for NTSC, it was 30 milliseconds. So 30 milliseconds is the fastest. So as long as your internet connection provides enough data throughput to update your screen, so it's actually, that's the gating factor. It's not the actual internet per se. And there's a lot of clever tricks people do to make sure that the gameplay experience is actually.
Could something like DLSS, could something like DLSS super sampling and stuff be used for cloud-based gaming?
I'd assume so. I'm not the expert to answer that, but I would. My short answer is I would assume so.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, we'll take another question from the chat. Sherelle, sorry if I pronounced your name wrong. How hard was it to set up a company as an engineering graduate?
Setting up a company, not hard. Running it, very hard. Yeah, setting up companies actually is the easiest thing to do. Making it work is, and we've got David on this call, and I'm sure he'll attest to it. Running a company is where the sweat and tears and the blood come in. But going out, taking an idea and just saying you're going to start your own company. I actually, others might disagree, but that wasn't the thing that I found the hardest. What I found the hardest was actually, once you were there, was how to sustain it through sort of the ups and downs. And, maybe if I'd done it even 3 years ago, I could have been sitting here telling you a different story. I just happened to be having my startup in 2020, and it's a kind of, it's one of those time, place, who you're with, where you are. There's so many things play into it that there's no one answer to that.
Okay,
all right.
That's good to know as engineers. Okay, should we see? I see a lot of the same people asking questions. Should we say every person gets one more question? I think that's fair. So if we go to the raised hands, Oshin,
Hi again, Bobby. Yeah, so I'm afraid my question is about monetization, which you were talking about earlier. EA and their FIFA series has recently come under a huge fire for, I believe it was child gambling when they were doing it with their monetization. So how do you see monetization moving forward if this is the kind of backlash that the gaming industry is facing?
Wow. Now, I think to so far, that's probably the most loaded question I've had. That's a really tough question to answer, Omar. Wow. Part of it comes from the fact that, by and large, gaming still has, it still is a kind of self-regulating industry. It has avoided sort of, regulatory oversight because it generally, and I do mean this, and I say this in good faith, having worked in the game industry. Yeah, game industry, particularly the console players, even the PC game publishers have been, very mature about, policing, self-policing that, and just how they monetize. But like any system out there, and this is true of iOS on App Store or Google, any ecosystem is only going to be as safe as its weakest link. So, if your kid picks up a parent's device or, something, gets access to their account and then chooses to, whether intentionally or unintentionally run up some bills, then yes, you're always going to have those. And yeah, I know what you're trying to say with, with FIFA having coming in for a bit of slack, but it's really hard to sort of, in my view, it's really hard to throw that at, and blame FIFA for it because, did they do something different that caused the problem, or was that brought on by, people's behavior? And it's different people will have different answers, and I can give you my view, but I think it's a really tough one. And if you bring in regulatory oversight, there's always going to be good and bad, right? There's a bigger discussion going on in the world about how do we police the Facebooks and the Googles and the Amazons of this world. I mean, if you want a loaded question, there's a bigger one, and then gaming by comparison, okay, it's huge. Don't get me wrong, gaming, $150 billion business globally, but it pales in comparison to, Facebook, Amazon, Google, Microsoft put together. So I think it's, they will find the solutions, but they won't be to everyone's liking.
Very diplomatic answer. David? Stoyanovsky?
So earlier you were saying to the other David about the differences in attitude and comparisons of engineering companies over in Japan, for example, versus here. But I kind of wanted to ask a bit more in detail what that is and where it comes from. Like, is it something to do with how the country in general is managed from a government perspective, or is it more of a social culture kind of thing? Because from my limited knowledge of Japanese culture, like it seems to me that they're a very like detail-oriented type of society. And is this anything at all relevant, or is it something else that you see?
I think, yeah, really quick answer is it's actually both. I think, the UK has seen, a decline in its engineering base the manufacturing base of the UK, you know, going way beyond, you know, your time and even my time. You know, this is something that's probably, you know, one could say 50, 70 years in the making. And, you know, it's conversely, you know, the one thing, for example, we've talked about in the past is how the UK is phenomenal at innovating, but it's really poor at commercializing. And, you know, graphene, for example, is a perfect example of that. Invented in the UK, but, you know, the people who got rich from it are in China and Korea. That's a sad fact, but that is. The other point you raised is cultural. Yeah, I mean, you know, I played you those videos. You know, just the sheer attention. You know, to become a sushi chef is akin to becoming a doctor. It takes 7 years to train to be a sushi chef. So yeah, there's part of it is cultural as well. There's just a attention to detail, attention to perfection. If you've ever heard of Zen, you know, which literally means kind of perfection. There's Kaizen. Kaizen means continuous improvement. You know, it's a motto companies like Toyota live by. So everything is driven, you know, every manufacturing process is driven by Kaizen. There's always, you know, it's how do you, you know, improve beyond what you've already approved. It's, you know, it's the pursuit of perfection. It's never ending, but it is. And you know, I'm not picking on the UK particularly, but there is a sort of, you know, Eastern versus Western difference in that, you know, in the East there just is a desire. There is a, you know, the desire to sort of pursue perfection for its own end is you know, it's seen as worthwhile, whereas, you know, for argument's sake, if you get to 95% of purity here, you know, the exponential cost of taking that to 98 is seen as being not worth it. So yeah, let's just stop at 95%. Whereas in certain other cultures, yeah, they will go the extra 100 miles just to get that 3% more.
But I imagine in technology where it moves so fast and so consistently forward with all of Moore's law and things like this, it's vital. But people don't necessarily seem to put two and two together. That you need to.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword, right? It can be, but then, you know, if you just take a car, for example, you know, it's something that you're not going to replace every 2 or 3 years. So, you know, people want something that they know is going to be reliable. You know, somebody else asked me, you know, somebody said, you know, what's the difference between PC and console gaming? And it's the user experience, right? It's what the user gets out of it. And that's a mindset, right? It's, for example, on a PlayStation, you know, and I do speak from personal experience, having done this, you know, getting your PlayStation to crash is like, you know, is akin to, you know, sin. That's hell, because it's a consumer electronic device, right? It is never intended to crash. You can't let your game freeze. So if you go on a PlayStation, right, if you find a game that actually freezes or has a bug in it, I mean, that's, you know, that's big thing. Whereas on a PC, it's like, oh, it's kind of flickering, it's crashing, I'll just reboot. People kind of accept it and they're like okay with it. You know, my PC freezes, damn, hit the reboot button. That doesn't work in a consumer electronic space, right? There's a mind that's just, what is it that you want the user to experience, right? And I bet you most console gamers would be screaming blue murder if their game was freezing every hour or something. Yeah. So that's to give you an idea, but yeah, it's really, it's about the user experience. It's, you know, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, last few questions. Omar, I saw you had a couple in the chat. Is there one in particular you wanted to ask?
Sorry, Zach.
So hi, is it my question on Bitcoin?
There was one on Bitcoin and one about Nintendo. Which would you prefer to hear the answer to?
Actually, you know what? Yeah, I'd like to hear the one about Nintendo, actually. Did you ever consider working at Nintendo?
I'd love to. Yeah, for again, just for the, again, different mindset, different end user experience.
Yeah.
Nintendo, for example, has taken the, very conscious decision of not getting in the sort of, power arms race.
Yeah.
So, it's not about, competition of, just how many teraflops it can clock at what speed. And, you've got all the people out there trying to compare how powerful, PS5 is versus a high-end PC, and people, thing. And then I think a lot of people just kind of, I mean, you got to allow them that, right? They want to compare that, but Nintendo's never been about that, and Nintendo again hasn't never really gone after third-party publishers. It's never said to Square or others, "Hey, we really need you to put your games on Nintendo." And I put that in a slide, right? I didn't really talk much about it, but one of the big differences between Nintendo and PlayStation is that Nintendo's platform is very much driven by first party. It's driven by the games it develops itself, right? Whether Pokemon's probably the only example, but Pokemon, for example, has never been on any other platform. It's exclusive to Nintendo. Okay? And then the same, whether it's Zelda, whether it's Mario, and I think Mario is now on others, but for the longest time, it was only ever made for Nintendo.
Expanding on my previous question, but I mean, just say like a year ago, what's it called? A company called Saber had ported a very demanding game like The Witcher 3 onto such a small hardware like the Nintendo. What's it called? Like it's these kind of things are becoming so much more prevalent now. How do you think Sony and Microsoft would react in such a way that they know that Nintendo can even maybe run a lot bigger games rather than just smaller platform games like Mario and
I think ultimately, whether it's in the next few years, but whether it's down the road, because it's more of the developer push, the publisher push, should I say more accurately, the sort of this idea of exclusive or being only on one platform is diminishing. Whether it's EA, whether it's Square, whoever it is, they have to monetize. As I said to you earlier, right? A really good top-end game can cost between $5 and $20 million to develop. And if you have to recoup that, you don't want to just be on PlayStation. You want to be on PlayStation, Xbox, Nintendo. You want to be on everything and anything. Wherever the user is, that's where you want to be. So if they're on PC, I mean, do you know you can play PlayStation games on PC? You just go to PlayStation Plus, right? It's you can play them on PC. So you don't need a PlayStation now.
I didn't know that actually.
If you go to PlayStation Plus, just go and sign in, buy a subscription. You can play all the sort of up to PS3. I think I don't know if it's PS4 games as well, but you can play them on your PC. It just runs a virtual machine on your PC.
Yeah, an emulator.
Creates a PlayStation virtual machine, and you can run it on. You can play them, and that's going to happen. I think that's just the way it goes.
All right,
so that's going to be, I mean, you also got to look on the flip side of it, is that it's not the Nintendos and the Xboxes that PlayStation is really competing against, right? PlayStation is in a really unique position because it has, 450 million users deployed, so it has a huge thing. But in the next iteration of this world, it's going to be going up against every company that I name that is coming up with game studios and game publishing. And that's not Xbox, it's Facebook, it's Amazon. It's if you look and see, just go and see what's Stadia, what Google is doing. I mean, they are, their intention is to bring console level gaming to the cloud, and I wouldn't put it past them to succeed if they can put, and this is what I said, when we were developing PlayStation 3, we couldn't go out and buy IBM. Just couldn't. It's just like, you can't. But it's just the pockets that Amazon and Facebook have. Google spent God knows how many billions on its driverless car tech, and it's willing to do it, right? It's willing to keep putting money in, and that's something that's very similar to the long game that that tech companies have to play. So you might think it's like fast changing, but actually that development curve, getting engineers come in, PlayStation cycles are 7 years. Normally a card cycle is 10 years. You sell a card today, you're selling something, you've got to last for 10 years. And that's the way it goes.
All right, thank you.
All right.
And I think we'll take a last question from you, Lee, if you still have a question to ask. I saw a couple in the chat.
No, I don't. I was just responding to the other.
Okay, then I have a personal question that I'd like to ask just to wrap up. I don't know if you heard from the KCLEA meetings. We now have 3 different engineering courses: biomedical engineering, electronics, and general engineering. If you had to give a piece of advice based on your career so far to those engineers who, I don't know, want to chase their dreams of working at Xbox or PlayStation, or even starting their own company, what is the one piece of advice you would give them?
My advice is quite simply, dream big and only do something if you're passionate about it. Because the only thing that really, really matters at the end of the day is passion. So I'll leave you guys with a little anecdote. When I was interviewing for PlayStation 20 odd years ago, one of the interviews I got from Okamoto-san was, what do you think PlayStation 10 is going to look like? And I'll open it up. Anyone want to take a stab? Who can answer that question?
I would say it's too crazy to even think of at the moment.
Okay. Well, the answer he was looking for, and this is what it comes down to, is that you have to dream big, is that in years to come, PlayStation could actually be a pill that you take, and it's going to be like a psychedelic experience. It's something that you play in your mind.
Sherelle wasn't far off in the chat when they said VR, but without the VR headset. That is a big dream.
So So give you an idea that somebody 20 years ago can think that, then that's kind of where you need to be, how you want to dream.
That is very good advice. I think we all get very distracted by coursework and modules, but I think dream big is a good piece of advice. Thank you very much, Bobby. As you can see, we've run over by an hour because people were very interested to hear what you had to say. And as I said before, I think your career is probably one of the most interesting I've ever heard of, just because you've done so much. And I don't know, I see a lot of the Elon Musks and Jeff Bezoses, and they're not very humble, and you are, and I love that. So thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us. I'm sure we could ask questions for another hour as well. We should probably go and have dinner. So thank you again.
Likewise, thank you for giving me the opportunity today. I really appreciate it. And yeah, if you are interested, next time I'm happy to come on and tell you a little bit more about, you know, my startup and what I did, what that was all about. And yeah, maybe a different kind of group of people would be interested in knowing that side of my life.
Yeah, I think the same group of people would come back and ask you even more questions.
It's been a pleasure, everyone. Thank you ever so much for having me on. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you. And this is our last talk before Christmas. So Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays. Have a good break, and I guess good luck for your exams. Not you, Bobby, but everyone else.
Yeah, well, let's see. Likewise, good luck to everyone. Happy holidays, you know, Merry Christmas for those of you celebrating Christmas, and yeah, good luck with your exams, and the very best of luck, and you know, just keep up the good work, and hopefully, you never know, our paths might cross someday in the future.
Yeah, dream big.
Yeah. I was just seeing that, you know, Ocean's put up his message. I was like, yeah, you might think that, you know, I made your childhood happy, but I'm sure plenty of parents hated me for turning lots of food into couch potatoes. So, you know, it came with a sting. All right, guys. Thank you ever so much. All the best.
Thank you.
David,
Bye.
pleasure seeing you.
Thank you.
Best.
See you.
Everyone, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.